So I'm smack dab in the middle of a TOA run, 355. The invocations are pretty bog standard, I think. The only difference is like overly draining, so P2 is kind of a longer phase. It's just how I've set it up. I just thought, why not record a TOA run and make it like a rambling-esque video. My channel doesn't really have much direction. It's kind of just whatever I feel like posting. Um, But yeah, we can just like ramble and play out a TOA. Speaking of TOA though, I always assumed raid content was kind of group content because of how they shipped it. Oh, I'm gonna get hit by that. No, I dodged it. Tile skipping. And I just didn't engage with the content. Yeah, some people can say like you could just get, you could practice and get good at the I think I might just in case Karis here. You could practice and get good at the other raids content outside of TOA, and you don't have to rely on a group. And that's true, but like, you could technically solo the Titans, right? But the content was released to kind of promote group play. And there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah, you could learn from the bottom up, but I think content that is so some people don't like TOA because TOA has an invocation system, and it's kind of like, oh well, why would you create a raids with like potentially? And I think the changes they've done recently are great. Like making purples less common, and this was like pre my time ever like raiding. So I say that even without being able to like utilize the better purple rates. Um, yeah, changing them to be less common because there are some significant rewards like Osmoten's Fang and stuff like that that are like best in slot in a lot of places, but they were worth like 10 mil. Now they're like 25 mil or something, the Fang, and then obviously the Shadow is really rare. But the ability to actually get those rewards at lower invocations and their changes and the commonality of it all were just really good changes. But I think people don't like invocation systems because they feel as though the content isn't challenging enough from the get-go to reward people. I've heard certain takes about like how it makes it like easier to engage with in-game content. But you want this. This is a net positive because what happens is the barrier of entry is low so that anyone can start at somewhere, and you don't have that that issue of like, for instance, Infernal Cape or even Jad. Nowadays, like even though there are people who could do it at level 3 with like plenty of patience and strats, it's still one of those things where people are daunted and kind of deterred from ever doing the content because it's such a significant investment, in terms of time, and it feels like you are already set up to uh, bang your head against the wall enough times until it stops hurting, and having barrier of entry that isn't daunting and knowing that it is very feasible that you could go into an entry and like learn it as you go, and it won't be so difficult that you know you won't be able to complete the content, especially because you can die so many times. I have hardcore mode on here, but those are things that you can build up to. This is like a great model because it brings in people who are afraid of the content because they're afraid they're going to, it's loss aversion. So I often incorporate, biopsychology in a lot of my explanations because it's a field of interest. But loss aversion is something that a lot of you have probably heard about, where you'd rather find $20 on the ground than lose $20. Let me explain that better, because the example they use is actually a lot better. But essentially, if you found $20 and lost it, you would rather have not found the $20 at all than to find it and lose it, even though you're going to technically be at the same like starting point. If you find the $20 and you lose it, you're still going to have the same amount of money as you would have had if you never found the $20. Hopefully that makes sense. I was thinking about how I could simplify that without making it convoluted. But yeah, you would essentially not gain anything at all if it meant you had to potentially lose it, or that was like the outcome. And so we want to avoid loss, even if again the baseline of what we have is always going to be the same amount. And this, goes into gambling as well, where people like gain $100 and then they lose it, and now it feels like they must gain it back, right? Because they have now lost the $100 that they had. Well, no, you're still at the point that you came in with. So you've technically not lost anything, but you are so loss adverse that you don't uh, want to leave without making that money back, And I imagine, as most things, there is a quote which names escape me, that evolution makes sense of everything. Everything in the light of evolution makes sense. And by that I mean, like, even if it seems absurd and it even seems like there's no selective pressures that would bring about a logistical or logical outcome, it still makes sense because those are the mechanisms at which all things evolve, right? So yeah, like it makes sense in this case, and I put an asterisk there because it's important not to think of evolution as something that's linear or that is logical because it's an unintelligent design. But it makes sense that we would want to avoid loss, even if it gives us a baseline, than to gain something and then eventually lose it and be at that baseline again. Um, because, our methods of survival was always group cooperation and, like, by and large, more so than hunting, we were what is the word for it? What am I thinking here? Not scavengers, but we are technically also scavengers in a sense. I mean, that wouldn't be our classification. Foraging, there you go. So, hunting and foraging, or hunter-gatherer, as you heard, but I think it's more apt to say gather-hunter. Anywho, yeah, so it's important to have like these low barrier of entry, but high skill ceiling um, content. Why is this not coming out of the bag? Am I not clicking it? Sometimes when I'm recording, it tends to drop my FPS a bit, but it shouldn't be like a massive deal. I kind of limit my CPU. There's like a turbo boost for certain CPUs, and you could turn it off using battery settings, but I'll spare you the technicalities. It essentially like makes your core temps so much lower, but you do drop FPS when your CPU throttles a bit. But yeah, like barrier of entry being low and skill ceiling being high is a very important modality for gaming because it enables multiple different people to engage with the content. There's a thing called neuroticism that a lot of people are vetted on. So, when we're talking about personality, disposition, the most scientifically backed and evident ones are the Big Five. The acronym for it is OCEAN, and it stands for openness. Let me remember them: conscientiousness, uh, extroversion, or introversion, but extroversion is on the. So extroversion is what you need to know, and then I'll tell you about the spectrum. A is agreeableness, and N is neuroticism. And sorry, I'm moving my mic. It's a swivel mic, so if it gets, if it makes a little bit of a crinkling noise, you know what's happening, or crinkling rather. So openness is kind of like so all of these dispositions are based on I'm trying to think which one I just clicked. Oh, I already clicked it here. What am I saying? Um, yeah, it's based on a spectrum, so most people are somewhere around, the middle of both spectrums, not on either extreme, but when they are, that's their disposition, and of course there are certain dispositions that are more akin to certain disorders or ways of operating. So, for instance, neuroticism, the N, um, is the levels of neuroticism, the disposition someone has, and this is kind of like the propensity you have um, genetically and environmentally. They're both intertwined. It's not nature or nurture. It's nature and nurture. It is the propensity you have to um, thank fuck that I didn't double click that because that would have been a waste. It's the propensity you have for negative emotions, and negative emotions can be boiled up to like, or rather boiled down to like depression and anxiety and withdrawal from individuals. So isolation, which is considered quote negative symptoms when we're talking about things like schizophrenia, which brings you away from um, individuals, which again is intertwined with levels of neuroticism. And then there's the opposite end of that spectrum, which is I'm obviously talking about extreme versus extreme, but we're somewhere like in the middle. The opposite end of that spectrum is like very, very non-anxious, very cool and collected, not really prone to anxiety or negative symptoms, maybe even more of like an optimist um, in how you operate. Did I use that sand view there? Sometimes the clicks are a bit off because my frames do drop a bit, but that's okay. So that's the end. That's neuroticism, and neuroticism is pertinent, and why I was bringing it up when we're talking about human behavior, um, because people with higher levels of disposition of neuroticism are less likely to engage in something that is daunting or anxiety-inducing. It's a deterrent, and did I fail to do that? Sometimes I take off the armor to make it easier, but he has like no defenses. Um, so oftentimes when people say, well, if you're going to play a game for X amount of time, you might as well engage with the content. Well, you have to think about what motivates someone to do certain content. Well, what deters someone, what precludes the behavior is oftentimes, that neurotic disposition where it's like, oh, well, when you overthink something without just trying it. There's a meme of fucking, just do it. Like most people have heard that meme. But that's really the kind of, I would say, the kind of ignorant optimism that people have, because people can't just change the way they feel about certain things. What they can do is they can respond differently and then hope that that reframes the environment. So we're talking about like CBT here, cognitive behavioral therapy, where like you can reframe something by thinking about it in a different light and perhaps take away some of the um, anxiety-inducing aspects of it. And one of the easiest ways to do this, and I say easy with leniency here, with loosely rather, one of the easiest ways to do it is to expose yourself to it. So the more exposure you have to something, the more likely it is to be more familiar. And we have a familiarity bias, so the more familiar something is, the more likely we are okay doing that thing without, much resistance. And a good example of this is um, like mid-tier content in the game. Not mid-tier, sorry. Is it mid-tier? Should I say mid-tier? I don't mean mid-tier as in like depreciation of it, but rather mid-tier as in like mid-game is, I think, the better way of saying it. Like a lot of people aren't afraid of engaging with this, or feeling daunted, because they believe that it is the mid portion of the game. It's not something that is considered high level. So this is a very intricate and maybe even gratuitous way, but again, owing back to the rambling nature of the video, to say that having low barrier of entry and high skill ceiling will be the best of both worlds. So I think TOA was probably the fucking landmark of all content going forward in terms of what they should think about when they talk about like in-game content. And I know there's going to be like a raids 4 and stuff like that, because again, I didn't even want to engage with this kind of content because it was always tailored to like group content. And also the idea of like just you know, the whole point is the learning process. But it's like, why would someone want to learn when they feel like they're constantly going to uh, have to fucking fail over and over again? And some people say, well, that's the point. You're supposed to fail over and over again, and then you get like the huge fucking dopaminergic value, the rush, and that is the payoff. Well, this is not an applicable thing for people who are, neurotic. And, spoiler, I am one of those people who's very daunted about content. And also, I have my personal gripes with certain content anyway, not because they're designed poorly, but because they appeal to a different type of person. And we're talking about, disposition here. And this is okay because RS is not a game that you complete. It's a game that you constantly. So the main appeal to RS is that everyone can have individual goals. There's no like specific direction. There's no right way of playing, and you have freedom in those goals. And when you do a certain goal, when you work towards a certain goal, there is that all the values that you get from that motivate you to continue playing. All the rewards that you get, which is the goal seeking or goal oriented behavior, which is very important for a human behavior, goal orientation. And this is like intertwined with RS. Of course, some um, direction is important when we're talking about like progression of account, but it shouldn't make you engage with content that you don't want to engage with, um, and you have the option to otherwise not engage with, and it wouldn't like deter you from being able to like enjoy other shit, which RS is pretty fucking good at. But going back to that acronym, uh, since we're gonna do a little bit of educating of disposition here. So I started with the end of the acronym for neuroticism. Um, Next would be the and don't mind the gaps and or the pauses and lulls in the conversation because of course I'm trying to look at certain things too. And I find that this highlight here is kind of like hard to see for me. It's just really thin and blends in with that shit, but it's not like too bad. Um, yeah, so we'll start with the O now. We'll start with the beginning of the acronym, which is openness. And openness is just like your disposition for like new activities, new experiences, being open-minded to, people's perspectives and stuff like that, being more receptive, um, being more creative is really where there's a lot of ties to it, creativity there, and again, it is a spectrum, so no one fits squarely in any given. And this is important to think about when we talk about. Did I? I don't think I hit that, did I? I'm gonna get hit by the fucking thing. I think I canceled it. Let's see. Oh, I think I did. Okay, never mind. Yeah, it's important to um, think of anything associated with behavior, first of all, uh, likened to chaos theory and the fact that like human behavior cannot be tracked, just like the weather, right? So like there are so many examples of this where you cannot predict human behavior. And it's important to think about statistics as like observational tools and not predictive tools. Yes, you can use the observation of certain data to make predictions, but it doesn't guarantee that the prediction will be right. And this is important to think about when we talk about statistics because people get kind of trapped in the idea that the statistic is reflective of the future events, and it's not. It's more so the observational data of current time and the um, propensity of predictive power, but not guaranteed. So going back to the openness, yeah, it's important to think of it as a spectrum, and I should have used liquid adrenaline here. I have overly draining on. If I didn't mention that, I think I did. So I just kind of use the specs here, but yeah, it's important to think of it as a spectrum and not as I think it's gonna hit me with the there it is, okay, and not as a either or black or white kind of thinking because this is very maladaptive thinking when we're talking about human behavior and most things. Most things are gradients, are shades of gray. They are not a black or white. That is actually a cognitive bias we have to kind of fit those neatly, because of course the brain is very pattern friendly and predictive in its like ability. So it's a very like map building kind of um, well organ. Um, so yeah, a creativity spectrum of that. So when we're talking about the latter end, when I'll compare the extremes. Of course, we are somewhere around the middle on average. Um, the latter end is like not being very open, not being very creative, open-minded. More I would say bullheaded, kind of. Is a way to explain it. It's not exactly about stubbornness, but it is about just open to new experiences, etc. Right? And I could skip here, but kind of feeling like a syrupy lag going on, even though it may not be represented on screen. Probably like 25 FPS or something over the 90, maybe a little bit more. But yeah, as I was saying, there is like the less propensity, the less disposition to like open-mindedness and new experiences and whatnot. So the C is conscientiousness, and conscientiousness often gets intermingled and mixed up with agreeableness. And I can understand why, because if you look at the definitions we've created, like in terms of etymology and stuff like that, we associate conscientiousness with a sort of agreeableness. But when we're talking about disposition of personality, it's important to realize that it is a different metric. So conscientiousness is like, oh, I hit a fucking banana or whatever. Yeah. Conscientiousness is like, how do I explain this? Someone who would like hold the door for you as you're walking in, someone who would be mindful of their time, they're very punctual, someone who is respectful and decor, expresses decorum in the right circumstances, so they're like very pro-social. I think pro-social is a really good way of putting it. It's not an antisocial behavior. I would say the latter is antisocial. So the latter is very disrespectful in certain circumstances, not really caring about people's time too much because they're not very punctual. You wouldn't mind being late. Um, Stuff of that nature is what the latter is on that spectrum of disposition. And E is extroversion. So extroversion is, it's pretty much in the name. Essentially, you're more outgoing, more um, you know, talkative, more given to discourse, more, capable of building relationships in social settings. You're very pro-social, but the aspect here, the importance is that you're very outgoing in behavior. And the latter of this would be introversion. And, this is why people often have a discrepancy between introversion and extroversion. Um, and the A is agreeableness. And this is where a lot of people get conscientiousness and agreeableness mixed up. Agreeableness is about the closest thing you can get to disposition of empathy. So empathy is like the ability to. So when we're talking about empathy, we have to talk about another topic as well. And by topics, I mean modalities. And again, it's important to remember all models are wrong, but some are more useful than others. And the idea is that they're not all encompassing, but they are useful for what they were built for and the circumstances that they're built in. Um, when um, we're talking about um, agreeableness and empathy. Empathy usually comes in two main ways. So you have affective empathy, which is affective just means relating to emotion. So affect and how you affect someone. The effect is the or affect someone. The effect is the result, the consequence. But affect is emotional. It's related to the feelings and the emotion. Um, So affective empathy is like the feelings you feel. So you feel sad, you feel angry, you can feel these emotions, you feel love, you can build connections like other people. This would be affective empathy or affective empathy. Um, Cognitive empathy is the ability to understand why people feel those things. A theory of mind where you understand the motivations. And of course, you could say, well, no one truly understands why someone feels. Yes, but when we're talking about cognitive empathy, we're talking about the ability to empathize cognitively, you know? And that's the important to think about when we're talking about empathy. So agreeableness is your ability to, I would say this is the best way to explain it when we're talking about disposition, is how cognitively empathetic you are. Because you can be very effective in your empathy. You can feel the emotions that other people feel. You can be very given to neurotic symptoms and anxiety and happiness and the full rich range of human emotion and the nuances in that. But you may not come across as someone as pro-social, as agreeable, as someone who is kind, right? Even though you're not a bad person. And you hear this, it's a trope that a lot of people I say a lot of people a lot, but this is just a rhetorical device. Um, Essentially, you see it a lot in like media, and you read it a lot in books, where the character is like a gray character, but you know that he does kind things. It's just the character himself is dubious in his behavior. Um, and these are obviously very interesting characters, but these characters would be a low agreeableness, so they would be on the latter end of the spectrum. And of course, when we're talking about like the extremes, we're talking about people with like antisocial personality disorder. And I'll give you an example of like cognitive empathy versus affective empathy when we're talking about the difference, or like examples of certain um, culminations of personality. And of course, nature and nurture here. So, for instance, autistic individuals, so autistic spectrum disorder, sorry, is often linked to cognitive or the lack thereof of cognitive empathy. So there's affective empathy. Of course, they feel emotions, but they don't really understand. And by they, again, rhetorical. I'm not talking about any specific person, but just autistic spectrum in general has an issue with um, like understanding the motivations of why people feel the way they do, or understanding why they would feel sad in certain aspects, and this creates, sometimes a masking issue, especially among women, because women learn really early on that the way they interact in there, and we're talking about a little bit of like sociology here, which is obviously relevant to this topic. They learn pretty early on that the way they operate in their environment and their culture and their groups and their kind of minorities of individuals who feel as though they are the um, oppressed, which we could talk about fucking the patriarchal system we have, but that goes into a whole other thing. But the idea is you learn that communication and socialization is the most important thing, and it's not just about feats of athleticism or solving issues with um, physical violence, which can tell you a little bit of the discrepancy between how women and men kind of interact. And it isn't to say that anyone is disposed to being violent by virtue of their sex, but the way our culture is, the way our sociology is, the way we're conditioned is what gives us that disposition rather than just genetic. But it is important to say this: your propensity for violence is heavily genetic. There's over like 50% of your genes involved with your propensity to be violent, but that violence in and of itself isn't particularly um, uh, related to being a male, but the males are more likely to be violent. And I would say the culture and the environment itself, not even, sans the fucking genetics here, is a huge, and I'm not saying you can just divorce the genetics, but is a huge factor on how we operate. I hate when that shit happens where it like drops right on you. Um, But yeah, when we're talking about like cognitive empathy, going back to my point, cognitive empathy is a very difficult thing for people who find it hard to understand the social motivations behind people's behavior. Um, so, in the case of like psychopathy, which I think it would be better said antisocial personality disorder, since psychopathy is not an official diagnosis of of or diagnosis of the DSM. We don't have like an official. It's kind of like a multitude of traits that are involved. So every psychopath is someone with ASPD, so antisocial personality disorder, but not everyone with antisocial personality disorder, say that many times fast, is someone who has psychopathy, or someone who evolves, rather adapts or devolves, whatever you want to say, into psychopathy or psychopathic person. Certain traits that give way to that. Um, which, if we are, just real quick, an excursion, as I do, because of course they are all so pertinent to bring up. Psychopathy works in two main forms: it's primary and secondary. And primary is genetic involvement, which of course genetics plays a role in all behavior, and that's the phenotype. And secondary, which is mostly involved with environmental circumstances more so than genetics, and often leads to a psychopathic person who is more likely to have neurotic symptoms. So anxiety, they don't have what is called fearless dominance, which is like a lack of anxiety and a predatory mode, a motive. But digressing from that, or that being the digression itself. Yeah, so when you're talking about psychopathy and you're talking about like affective empathy, they don't have affective empathy. And by that, I don't mean they don't feel emotions at all, but the idea of affective empathy is that um, the emotions they feel are very akin to the average person. So, like a person with autism would feel a range of emotions that are similar to the average person. Um, but the psychopath would not, right? Their superficial behavior, their charm, their ability to kind of disregard relationships. It isn't to say that they're, I once read the title of a very poignant, lachrymose um, uh, study that outlined, uh, you know, sympathy for the psychopath. And I remember that being the title. I was racking my brain to figure what it was, and I thought it was very moving, because the idea of like the psychopath, especially secondary psychopathy, is that they have a lot of things working against them environmentally, and the loneliness and suicidality, and very neurotic symptoms go hand in hand. And this is a person who has just been very betrayed by their environment. Not to say that I am condoning any kind of psychopathic behavior, but what I am saying is sympathy for the psychopath given the circumstances. That to me is compassion. It's not that you're agreeing with it. It's not that you're having a moral judgment on it. It's that you're trying to understand what comes to, or what are the circumstances to why this comes to fruition. And yeah, but yes, psychopathy wouldn't have effective empathy in this regard because of the like lack of homogeny between the average person. And I should say, just for the record, that when we're talking about diagnostics, of course we have modalities for it, and it's not perfect. There are a lot of idiopathic things, which is essentially just something that the cause of it isn't understood. It's specific to the person. But we do have these modalities. We do have these diagnostics because um, this is the only way we can create a treatment plan for individuals, or to avoid future circumstances of whatever comes to be with those circumstances. And yeah, it's um, Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to pay attention to so many things. So I was going to say it's important to think about like all of our brains are technically atypical. So when we're talking about neurodivergence, we're technically all neurodivergent. The way our brain lateralizes, so like what areas of the brain are responsible for certain things, all deviate. The areas of the brain in volume size, the sexually dimorphic cells. You could go through something called like chimericism and not know that you have different cells in different areas because you had a twin. And I mean, that's just one example. And I could go on, and I don't want to fucking inundate whoever's listening, maybe in the background or whatever. But the idea is that there is no typicality, there's no binary of human behavior or human anatomy. And in even well, when we're talking about anatomy, of course they look similar, and I think the anatomy is what gets people confused. But what I should say is the physiology, or the like how the parts operate, and what they consist of. Even morphologically, we are similar, but the actual function is vastly different. Neuronal migration, etc. But um, yeah, so psychopathy doesn't tend to link with what our diagnostics of affective empathy is, but someone with like autism, for instance, would. Or cognitive empathy is one that I personally believe psychopathy does not link to, but some people say otherwise. The reason for that is that they can manipulate individuals, but I don't think that's telling of understanding why people feel the way they do, because again, you don't have the same kind of motivations. I think that's just duplicitous behavior, and that goes hand in hand with like intelligence and kind of adapting to the environment. I don't think it has anything to do with actually understanding the emotion itself. But this is kind of something that, for instance, autistic people would probably have an issue with, which is the cognitive understanding part. But the affective one is absolutely true. Um, so this is just an example of something we talked about on fucking P2. Um, so here's on last row, I'm not always proficient. I like to keep moving and then just occupy areas that are not taken. I think I'm going to do this because 20 seconds doesn't feel too long. Oh, I am trolling a bit. Oh wait, I don't have prayer up. My bad, I almost fucking griefed. I didn't see my prayer drop so bad. I also have the sound effects really low. I like to keep zoomed in, but I have the sound effects kind of low. So I'm probably gonna... There we go. I griefed a little bit at the beginning. Could have got fucking destroyed if I didn't notice my prayer. I don't usually need ambrosias, but I kind of just move and wait for the ticks. I keep myself zoomed in so I can keep the shadows. So I can see the shadows properly. And my volume is kind of low, so sometimes I do need to listen. So like I just heard that. There we go. Okay, that's not bad. 45 minutes. I usually finish it around 42 minutes. Again, P2 is pretty long because of the overly draining. Post 3, you don't get any benefit, so 4 is not a beneficial thing. I have 106 completions on expert, 350 plus, most on 355. So this setup, um, only 2 purples in that 106. So I think that's kind of dry, but you know, still 2 purples. But you can't complain. Every time you open this shit, sometimes you can get a pet. That'd be really cool if I got a pet there. Sometimes the loot is sad, but this 700k is not bad, and I get its balance behind the whole you can get a purple chance kind of thing. And yeah, so this was a TOA run, and I know a lot. We went everywhere with the rambling, and some of it may have been convoluted, some of it may have made a lot of sense, but I find that like there is no such thing as a better field of study than another. It's just about pertinence, and they all kind of implicate each other at some point. But of course, you don't have to look very far to learn up close, and vice versa. And this is important to think about for a lot of things. There's no such thing as like a better evolution, right? These are strategies in survival, and if they work, they work. They're animals that predate us, like ants, for instance, that fucking permeate the entire world and are very complicated and sophisticated in their groups and their group behavior, use sociality. But the idea is that you can see how my brain tries to analogize and link a lot of things to make more sense of it. And I think the more you can create examples of it, and maybe even the fact that you can simplify it into other things, is very important when you're uh, having discourse or even sharing something. And I like being educated, and I like educating individuals, and this is just kind of the rambling-esque behavior that I exhibit when I'm talking about rambling, and of course, trying to play the game and stuff, because I'm not like super seasoned. Like I've got 100 hours or so, maybe 105 hours or so in TOAs, but I'm not at like 400, 500 runs yet. Um, but yeah, just thought it would be interesting to have a TOA run and maybe um, look at this in the future. But of course, this all you could keep going on and on about these topics and really just hit how they intermingle with each other and how they implicate each other. And I wanted to kind of talk about more than just the design of you know barrier of entry and high skill ceiling with like things I think about like certain skills in the game. And I'll just say disclaimer: best skill in the game for like utility is construction. I think if you thought about it for 5 minutes, you'd understand. Outside of questing, it's probably the most progression you can get on your account, and maybe diaries. But yeah, that's it for me. And yeah, if you watched, cool. If you didn't, that's fine. I'm probably gonna look at it myself in the future. I'm sure I'll forget how to fucking do TOA runs when I get like a year away from it. Maybe after I grind it for like a month or so, or maybe longer. I don't know. I can't foretell the future. So maybe this will be like a learning thing for me. Um, yeah.